Good morning and welcome to the Bible class this morning. We are going to be in Luke chapter 21, and we have a lot to say about this chapter. I hope that you will take your Bibles and follow along with me this morning. We have a short little section to look at in verses 1 through 4, and then we're going to talk about some signs in verses 5 through the remainder of the chapter, and we'll spend quite a bit of time dealing with that. Hope that you are having a good week, and certainly we are missing seeing many of you. I hope that you are able to pick up your Bibles and to study on a regular basis. I also encourage you to get my worksheets and to think about these things ahead of time, fill them out, and follow along with us here on Sunday mornings. We read the first 4 verses, and we'll talk about those. As he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "I tell you the truth," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on." Now, I want to remind you of where we finished up last week. When we finished up last week, Jesus was again giving a very stern condemnation to some Pharisees for the way that they were acting and the way that they were behaving. He talked about how they like to have the attention thrown their way. They loved to be greeted in the marketplaces. They loved to wear the clothing that called attention to them. They wanted the important seats. And I also remind you in verse 47, he says that they devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers, and then finish by saying that such men will be punished more severely. And then you have this switch right here that then goes to this woman that has been very exemplary as far as giving is concerned. Where Jesus is sitting, he can see that treasury box, and it's a box that as people came into the temple that they could make their gifts. Now, as you know, for years and years and years, we had just passed a plate down one row and another. But since this virus has come around, we've got a box out in the auditorium, and that's where we allow people to drop their gifts. And that's exactly like what was taking place in the temple a long time ago. The box just sits out there, and you placed your gift in that as you went into the temple. Well, as Jesus is sitting back and watching, there are some folks that are making a show out of that. They are making sure there is a tremendous amount of clanging going on from their coins, or they're making sure that people are seeing what they're waving around to point out that I'm going to give a lot, that I'm really presenting a lot of money to this particular cause. These are people that were rich. On the other hand, he says that there is a poor widow there that's going to give a very small amount. Very small amount. 2 small copper coins. And I suspect if you just think more about our day and time, it's like, here's a lady that's got 2 pennies and she's throwing 2 pennies in the box. Well, there's 2 questions that I ask you. Who gave the most money-wise? Well, if you're just talking about money, the rich are the ones that's given the most. But who gave the most percentage-wise? Well, that's this poor widow. You see, 2 cents is all that she literally had to her name. These 2 small copper coins, that's it. That's the entirety of all that she has, and she placed those 2 coins in there. Well, what is this woman saying? This woman certainly is saying that she is given her all. She is saying that she is placing her hope, her faith, and her trust in God. I think we need to learn that her devotion was to God, that her devotion was to the Jewish way of life, to use what Jesus used in some of his teachings. She was laying up treasures as far as heaven is concerned. You see that there is a tremendous amount of sincerity in what this woman is doing. And it is important that it says that she gave out of her poverty. Even though she was hurting for a lot of things, she has gone to give still to that cause. Now, I want to give you a thought question here, and I want you to think about something with me. And I admit that I had not really ever considered this before, and I ran across this whenever I was preparing this lesson. And the first time that I read it, I thought, well, I've never heard that before. I don't know if I'm going to swallow that or not. But the more I got to thinking about it, the more I also stopped to think about the context here. And context does matter. Now, I want you to think about here in the end of chapter 20, he is condemning the Pharisees and condemning their religious acts. And then when we get to verse 5 through the rest of this chapter, it's talking about how the Jewish way of life is totally going to be destroyed. So I asked the question, have maybe we missed part of the point of what Jesus was saying right here? And when I say that, I want you to realize that the temple worship was not at all like what it was supposed to be at that day and time. And I also want you to catch that phrase again from verse 47 in chapter 20, that they were devouring widows' houses. You know, take for example, this woman gives those 2 cents. She gives those 2 small copper coins. That's all the money she's got. If she's got a debt coming, how's that debt going to be paid? Well, I'm sure there was some Pharisee man that could step up and say, well, I'll give you such and such for your house. And that would have been a low bid, not what it's really worth. But it put her in a very, very bad predicament. Jesus says some things about what this woman is doing, but to actually add commentary to that, he didn't. When I look at this, she was following the teachers of the law at that day wholeheartedly. Now, the rich folks weren't doing that. The Pharisees would have simply said, you know, here's what the law says, that you are to give and you are to give abundantly. She would have been doing that. Their system was wrong, and Jesus is condemning their system. And I think he's pointing out one way in which they were abusing even the poor people at that day and time. Which brings me to this question. Do church leaders, church preachers, abuse the poor today? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. There are so many so-called empires that's built by especially your television-type preachers. Who's it built on? By and large, it's built on the back of the poor. There are many preachers or spiritual leaders that are asking for gifts for their ministry. And they ask and they ask and they ask and they ask, and they tell you what tremendous blessings will come your way. You can research some of these individuals and find out how that they are worth millions. And you can see how that they extravagantly spend their money. And yet their money has come from people that really did not even have the means to do what they did, but they did it anyhow. Now, they did it out of love for God. They did it for the idea that they'll be blessed somehow, some way. And I believe that God knows that and God understands that. But there are people that are giving up everything that they have for a false religion. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that being taught by Jesus here within this message as well. So that's just something for you to think about. I'm not saying that's exactly the way it is there. Quite often, as a preacher, we just go to verses 1 through 4 and just pull that out and just talk about that. But it is sitting right between 2 passages that are very much condemning all that's going on in the Jewish way of life. Now, I want to begin with verse 5, and we're going to go through the end of the chapter. And this is a very important section of Scripture to look at. And it's one that there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about in this day and time. As I've told you before, I like to listen to what they call Christian radio. And one of the stations I listen to is 91.7 on the FM dial. There's a lot of preaching on that station, and I hear a lot of good preaching, and I hear a lot of good exposition. But I also know that that station is associated with the Moody individuals. They have a school up in Nashville, or not Nashville, in Chicago, and they pretty much expect you to follow some guidelines if you're going to be on that radio station. And one of the things that I have found that everyone that gets on there is going to talk about at some point in time is this idea that's known as premillennialism. Premillennialism. Well, what is premillennialism? Well, that, first of all, is somewhat hard for me to define because even among those individuals, there's various ideas as to what is going to happen. But what I will find is that they will take a lot of things that's said right here in Luke chapter 21, also in Matthew chapter 24, and also Mark chapter 13, and they will combine those things with a lot of things that's found in the book of Revelation. And all they talk about is prophecy, prophecy, prophecy. I want us to look very closely at what is being said here in Luke chapter 21 today, and I want us to have a good understanding of what that's going to be about. Now, as I get started, I would first of all say to you, if you are familiar, you know that I usually have a worksheet that's about 1.5 pages to 2 pages long. This one's 5 pages long. And there's a lot of comments that I have added on here as well. So I am nowhere near to finishing this particular chapter today. So I want you to put some thought and some time into this chapter. And what does this chapter mean? And how would you explain to someone what is being said here in this chapter? Now, the idea of premillennialism. I found a timetable that an individual has written. And I want to point out again what is said. Again, a lot of variation from church to church and preacher to preacher. But here's some of the ideas that first of all are expressed. The basic belief starts off this way. As you know, there were several of Jesus' apostles that believed that Jesus was going to set up an earthly kingdom. And they wanted to be part of that earthly kingdom that was going to help overthrow the Romans. And that's why they asked, can one of us sit on your left side and one on your right side? And that's why they were so devastated when they saw Jesus nailed to the cross, because everything that they had hoped for and everything they had planned for was over and done with. And even as Jesus is standing in their midst and just moments for ascending back into heaven, they ask, when will you restore the kingdom? They had a lot of misunderstandings, and they were thinking only in terms of things that were physical, earthly. They, during the course of time, realized he was talking about spiritual things, and they built up God's spiritual kingdom. Well, the first thing that premillennialism says is that God sent Jesus to this earth to establish his kingdom, but he was rejected by the Jewish people. And so it's almost as if God's, just kind of scratching his head and thinking, what's going on and what do I need to do? Well, I tell you what, I'll just start the church, and then after a period of time, I'll send my son back. And so the kingdom idea is postponed, and the church is instituted as a stopgap measure. Now, I know that there are some folks who would deny that, but there are also many that will openly say that, and that's really the idea that's behind premillennialism. They are going to talk about the last days, the last times, talking about that being centuries beyond what we talk about here in Luke chapter 21. This really picked up in 1948 when there was now a nation called Israel once again. And if you are like me and reading newspaper headlines for the last 20 years, every time something happened in Iraq or Iran, there were people that simply said, look, this is fulfillment of what the scriptures are saying. And there are people that are saying, look what Russia's doing now. Now this is fulfillment of what scriptures are saying. So this really picked up in 1948 when the nation of Israel was reestablished. Well, they believe that the events of the last half of the 20th century, then on into the 21st century, if time lasts, will be the fulfillment of all these end-time prophecies. And that's how they're seeing Luke chapter 21. They believe that there will be an invisible second coming of Christ. They believe that there will be a rapture and the first resurrection will occur. They believe that there is a day coming when everybody that really is a Christian will just like that disappear and they won't be here. So no good people left on this earth, only people that have not become followers of God. Believe that church will be taken up to heaven itself for 7 years. They believe that the prophecy that is found in Daniel about the various different weeks culminating with that 70th week is all about this as well. There is an idea behind them that the Roman Empire is going to be revived as well, and there will be 10 states in Europe that will unite together. They'll be called the 10 United States, and this will be the new Roman Empire. There will be a Roman dictator that for a period of time will sign a peace treaty with Israel, but all nations will come under this so-called new Roman rule. Jews will repossess Jerusalem. They're there now, but there's also Islamic people that are there. The Islamic people do worship at the Dome of the Rock. They say that day is coming in which that will be removed and the temple is going to be rebuilt. So a lot of our friends and neighbors literally believe that Jesus Christ is coming back to this earth to set up a throne in Jerusalem, that a temple will be rebuilt once again and worship will take place in that temple. I believe there will be 144,000 Jews that will then begin to go out and to preach, and that all Jewish people will be converted to Christianity, and there will be a time of peace which is known as the Pax Roma, the Roman peace. Well, the time will come when this Roman dictator will then proclaim himself as God, and then that they see as the Antichrist who's going to desecrate the temple. There'll be a new and a false world religion, which they refer to as the mystery of Babylon from the book of Revelation. These 144 martyrs will then be persecuted. Great tribulation in the entire world. There's kings of the south. By that, people are saying that's from Egypt, Africa, Arab nations, that they are then going to attack Israel. Kings of the north, they see that as Russia will invade Israel. The kings of the west, that's the European countries, will then come and attack and destroy the king of the north. And then there is the king of the east. And, they're going to have 200 million soldiers. Who else could that be but the Chinese? And so you hear all of these things talked about. Then there'll be the battle of Armageddon. There'll be the second coming of Christ, and this one will be visible. The church saints which have gone to heaven are going to come back to this earth for a period of time, and Jesus is going to be on the Mount of Olives. The Antichrist destroyed. There'll be tribulation for the martyrs. The Old Testament saints are going to be raised. Christ is going to sit on David's throne in Jerusalem. There's going to be the separation of the sheep and the goats. It's talked about in Matthew chapter 25. The curse that was placed on the land back in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, that's going to be removed, and this is going to be a beautiful, lush world once again. The curse that was put on people at the Tower of Babel is going to disappear, and all the world is going to have one language. And matter of fact, animals are even going to start speaking again. Satan will be bound for 1,000 years while Christ is reigning here on this earth. Mosaic law will become in force again. People are going to expect to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and there's going to be 1,000 years of peace and prosperity on this earth as Christ sits on his throne in heaven. Then Satan's going to be released, and nations will be deceived, and there'll be a season of rebellion, and there'll be the battle of Gog and Magog, the resurrection of the wicked, the last judgment, and those wicked will be cast into hellfire, then the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. Does the Bible really teach all of that like that? And when we're looking at Luke chapter 21, is that what Luke chapter 21 is really saying to us? Very prominent ideas. So if you are talking to your religious friends, I'll guarantee you the vast majority of them are following some part, if not the majority, of what we just talked about there. One of the first things I want you to realize as we start this premillennialism timetable that we're looking at, the first time it's ever talked about by someone is by a man by the name of John Darby in the year 1830. And I want that to sink into you. 1830. So the hundreds, the 200s, the 300s, the 400s, the 1100s, the 1200s. You got to get up all the way to 1800s before this concept comes out. Well, let's begin. And I'm going to start with verse 5, and let's go through verse 9 as we start with this morning. And again, I want you to put your thought into this. You may have gotten mailings to your door that say, so-and-so is coming to town on such and such a date to talk about prophecy. But this kind of things they're going to talk about. So let's let the Scriptures see, or let's look at the Scriptures and see what they say. And I'm going to say I am nowhere near going to claim to know it all, nowhere near going to say that I'm an expert. But I think there's some pretty simple things to understand as we look at this 21st chapter. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus says, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place? He replied, watch out that you are not deceived. For many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Well, the first thing that we see is that there are disciples there with Jesus, and we actually know who those disciples were. In Mark chapter 13 and verse 3, it tells us Peter, James, John, and Andrew are the ones that's going to ask this question, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign that they are about to take place, because of what Jesus has said about this building. This temple, Herod's temple, was a very magnificent building, a very beautiful building to look at. It is called beautiful by these men because it was an architectural wonder at that time. They worked on this thing for years and years and years, always trying to beautify it. It was made of some brilliant white stones. There was also some polished stones within it. It had many levels, and it was placed upon a hill so that it stood hundreds of feet above the Kidron Valley, so you could look up and it just catches your attention as you're seeing that. And they literally covered parts of this building in gold. They also noticed that there were gifts dedicated to God. These are known as votive gifts. These were gifts that people gave to symbolize the vows that they would make. It may have been something like a plaque, or may have been like a sculpture, some artistic treasure that was placed there in order for someone to see that someone made a vow, someone made a promise to God, and they gave that to represent that promise. What did Jesus say about this building? Oh, it's magnificent right now. It's a real eye-catcher right now. But Jesus said this building will be destroyed so that there will not be one stone left on top of another. Which caused these disciples to ask two questions. And it's not really even the same two questions that are going to be asked in Matthew and in Mark. In Matthew and Mark, it's going to be asking about his second coming. Well, Luke doesn't record that here. Luke says the two questions that they asked was, when will these things happen? They want a timeline. And what is the sign that they are about to take place? So that's what Jesus is about to answer for them here, what follows in the remainder of this chapter. Jesus gives a specific answer to that in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 36. It will happen on this generation. And there are two different passages here in Luke chapter 21 that's going to give us the same idea, and we'll point those out as we come along. There are many philosophies among people as to when this will happen. The vast majority of people today are still looking at all of the things that's about to be discussed here in Luke chapter 1 in the future. But we need to just look and see what Jesus said in the answer to those two questions to his disciples there at that time. I want you to understand that they had a very difficult time imagining that temple being destroyed. And I also would say to you that they thought that if the temple was going to be destroyed, like what Jesus said, that's certainly got to be the end of the world. So there's a lot of confusion in their mind, but Jesus is going to give an answer. Well, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to start off with a warning to them that there are many that will claim that I am he. There are many that are going to say that I'm Jesus. You know, there are people still today saying, I am Jesus. And quite often we just write them off as someone that's, not too mentally well off. But there were literally people in Jesus' time, after his death, that would come and they would say, I am Jesus. And they would say that the time is near. In Acts chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, we find that there is Simon the sorcerer, and Simon the sorcerer said that I'm that great power. In other words, I'm God. You need to listen to what I have to say. We find in Acts chapter 5 and verse 37 that there was Judas the Galilean who led a revolt, and this Judas would say that I am Jesus. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 6, there's a Jewish sorcerer. His name is Bar-Jesus. Now the Scriptures doesn't say to us, and I would point out to you that Jesus was a common name at that time. Its counterpart is Joshua. Both of them means the Lord saves. So I can't not say this for a fact, but Bar-Jesus means son of Jesus. So I don't know if he was talking about Jesus Christ or someone else. This happened a lot. Josephus said that during the reign of Nero, that's after Christ's time, that's the time that the Apostle Paul would be establishing congregations. During the reign of Nero, while Felix was procurator of Judea, deceivers and false prophets were so rampant that some were apprehended and executed almost on a daily basis. Hear what history records? Not a day goes by but what there's somebody saying, I'm Jesus, I am the way, follow me. They thought, well, there was the one real true Jesus and he had a following, so if I say I'm Jesus, I'll get a following. And all those that followed him, now they follow me. They knew that Jesus was alive on this earth and ascended into heaven, so it's just logical to say, well, I am Jesus, to get that following. Jesus is warning them about that. In verses 9 and 10, he says, when you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. Wars and rumors of wars, that's the phrase that we hear. Don't be afraid. It says that the end will come, but not right away. Well, what happened during that time? In the Annals of Tacitus, which is before AD 70, he listed many wars. The Romans were involved in war in Britain, war in Armenia, disturbances in Germany, insurrections in Gaul, intrigues among the Parthians, commotions in Africa, commotions in Thrace. He says there were Jewish uprisings in several locations. He said there was one in Caesarea and 20,000 Jews lost their lives. One in Scythopolis where 13,000 Jews lost their lives. One in Alexandria where 50,000 Jews lost their lives. And one in Damascus where 10,000 Jews lost their lives. Wars were not proof that the end was near. But every time a war breaks out today, what are people saying? Oh, Jesus is coming. This is prophecy. Well, we're going to stop there today, and I hope that you can follow along with me next week. There's so much more to say. We've only got through verse 9, and we'll start with verse 10 next week. And it's so important, I believe, to understand what Jesus is saying in response to those two questions. Thank you for listening this morning.